We've had computers in schools since the 1970s, and learning hasn't panned out the way we thought it would. Chris Dede is an expert in technology and schools, and he's here today on the science of learning. I'm Keith Sawyer, and I've got Chris Dede here on the science of learning. He's an expert in technology and learning. Chris, welcome to the science of learning.
Keith, thank you so much for inviting me.
So, Chris, what's going on with computers in schools? Why is it that learning hasn't changed in the way we thought it would?
Well, as you point out, I have a long-term perspective on this because I really got involved in a big way with computers and learning in the mid 70s when Apple came out with the Apple I. And all of a sudden, it wasn't punch cards anymore, and the interactivity made a huge difference. So that's half a century of watching. And it's been discouraging to me that decade after decade, computers have been used in a way that doesn't really take advantage of their opportunity to improve learning. So basically, computers have been used as kind of digital duct tape to try to keep an obsolete industrial era model of schooling going, teaching by telling, learning by listening, testing by regurgitating, and so on. And um, the emphasis with computers has been on doing things better. Oh, computers can help us reach larger numbers of people with our lectures. Computers can help us prepare quizzes very, very quickly. Computers can let students practice taking tests. And there's nothing wrong with doing things better if what you're doing is a good idea. But if you're doing things better with something that isn't a very good approach to education, then you just have a faster way of doing the wrong thing. But parallel to this, throughout um, the last half century, there have been people who have used computers well. And I would put myself in the category of someone who has tried to do that, to use them to do better things. And the better things are based on what we know about learning, which is that it's better if learning is active, it's better if learning is collaborative, it's better if learning is devoted to authentic problems that have relevance in students' lives. It's better if assessments are based on performance rather than psychometric, finding the right answer among a midst of distractors, and so on. And so it's interesting to watch the dialogues about computers in education because the critics pick all of the examples out of using computers in the wrong way and say, well, they haven't been worth it, which is true if that's the only examples you pick. And the advocates pick all the examples out of using computers well, but that doesn't mean that it's been worth all the money that people have spent on using computers poorly. So the hope is that we can find some way of breaking this sort of stalemate. That's not just the last half century. I mean, schooling is the only thing that someone from 2 centuries ago would recognize in the modern world. Somehow it's the one sector that reduces any attempt to change the model. And the hope is that we can break through that glass ceiling for using technology well.
All right. So I should say for our listeners that Dr. Chris Dede is a professor at Harvard University and a learning scientist. And I invited him to write a chapter in the first edition of the Handbook of Learning Sciences all the way back in 2006. So, can you give an example of an application of technology in schools that you think is aligned with the science of how people learn?
So I'll be immodest and talk about work that my colleagues and I have done, in part because I have a really careful understanding of it. Professor Tina Grotzer at Harvard and I and others who were postdocs or visiting researchers or graduate students or undergraduate students all participated in over a 10-year period developing 4 ecosystem science curricula, 3 for middle school students and 1 for elementary school students. And I'll just sketch the one for elementary school students as an example. Third graders can enter an ecosystem that begins by just having a stream running through a forest. And they then travel in time at 4 intervals over a 14-year period, in which they end with a large pond with a lot of dead trees in it, inhabited by beavers and woodpeckers, neither one of which was around at the beginning. And so the interesting challenge for them is what happened within a relatively short period of time to completely transform this ecosystem. And because they're third graders, of course, we want to scaffold that learning. So they are learning actively. They are ecosystem scientists who enter this virtual ecosystem and try to sort things out. But they have some supports. For example, they can become the beaver, and they can walk around as the beaver and try to cut down trees for their dam and not be eaten by the wolf that likes beavers for breakfast and so on. And then they can become a woodpecker and fly around the forest as it's changed by the pond and peck at trees for ants and so on. And then, just to make sure that we were really trying to hit the maximum of what third graders could do, there's a second virtual setting in which they're doing computer modeling. So now they're using a block-based computer programming language tailored for the ecosystem to program a virtual beaver and to program a virtual woodpecker in order to understand the ways that those species are shaping the ecosystem. Now, that's basically about a 3-week curriculum. We studied it and got wonderful results from it, showing that even with all that stuff, we hadn't hit the ceiling in terms of what third graders could do. And when we looked at the curriculum standards, of course, there wasn't anything in third grade standards that looked like this. There were some things in the middle school standards. There were some things in the high school standards. And the fact that we had third graders doing that illustrates just how broken, not only the schools are, but the standards are, because the standards are based on, a very teaching by telling, learning by listening approach to what students can actually master at different ages. So that was a demonstration of concept of what was possible with modern technologies that were practical and affordable in a classroom setting. And particularly with the pandemic, we thought that maybe people would want to do this because they were having to do virtual schooling anyway. So it's always been freely available on the Harvard website. But no, people just gave lectures over distance, which of course doesn't work very well, even less well than it does in classrooms. So that was an example, we feel, of building many, many aspects of learning science into a practical and affordable curriculum that didn't rely on exotic technologies that could be done with phones or standard classroom technologies. But it still didn't break through in terms of making a difference at scale.
Right, right. Yeah, I often say that one of the most solid findings in the science of how people learn is that lecture is bad. And that I've heard some people say that lecture is educational malpractice, and that it, as you say, active learning, active hands on learning, or that system you described, I'd say project based learning, and you figured out a way to do it online. It sounds almost like a kind of game based learning. Would you call it that? Is it like almost like a computer game? Is that right?
Well, I prior to the EcoLearn curricula, I and a different team over a 10-year period developed a pioneering curriculum called River City that was one of the first uses of immersive technologies in pre-college education. And we designed it as a simulation. You went back in time to the 1870s, and you were in a little community, River City, that had three diseases going on, authentic to the period. And your challenge was to figure out which causes were creating each of the diseases, and how could you intervene in the city in order to reduce the diseases and help people to lead better lives. Now, that was a simulation. It was a game-like simulation, but we were careful not to have winners and losers or strictly structured rules or some of the other things that are characteristic of games. But everybody said, "Oh, what a wonderful game this is!" And I finally got tired of saying it's a simulation, not a game. I just said it's game-like. So I think that there's a middle ground between simulations and games that are game-like simulations that actually are better than games in the sense that they're not distorting the authenticity through rewards and rules, but that still can draw on the powerful ways of engagement that we see in games.
Is there something that doing it on a computer adds? Could you do the same thing without a computer? Like, say it's a board game, or say the kids are outside in the woods doing it. I mean, computers are getting a lot of criticism these days. I read an article by Molly Worthen, who's a professor here at my own university, University of North Carolina, very critical of games on computers. So, what is it that doing it on a computer adds? Is there some advantage in the context of what we know about the science of learning?
Well, I think that's a great question. And my answer would be that it's both and, it's not either or. One of the four curricula that we developed was not an immersive ecosystem, it was an augmented real ecosystem. So we took cell phones and put software on them, and students would visit a real pond and wander around the pond. And when they got to certain points, the phone would activate and point out something that they could look at or ask them to do a particular activity. And that augmented reality ecosystem we contrasted to a similar pond ecosystem that we had built for middle school students. And we found, unsurprisingly, that the two complemented one another. That students, when they visited the real ecosystem, had a better understanding of the causality and what was important to pay attention to because they had been in the simulation. But they also learned that some of the things that the simulation did that were kind of easy were not easy when you really do real science. So in the simulation, you clicked on the water and you got a water quality reading. Well, when they tried to do that with the real pond, they came up against stochastic variation and where you took the sample mattered. And by the way, you had to try not to fall into the pond because that created all sorts of problems for the teacher, and so on and so on. So that was a both and that I think was important. And could the pre virtual world have been classroom activities that didn't even involve technology? Absolutely. The students didn't enter the ecosystem on day one. They had pre activities that the teacher led that help them to understand just what an ecosystem scientist is and what are the kinds of things that you can do when you enter a new environment that can help you observe what's going on and start to identify things that you're curious about. So there was a lot of outside of technology and outside of the classroom as well that went into the total curriculum that we developed piece by piece, but that nonetheless was available. And I think that that's a very legitimate point of view to look at. But again, it tends to be polarized. So um, a lot of the critics don't say much of what I see is of low quality, but when it's of high quality, the gains are very impressive. No, it's either games are good or games are evil, and um, it's hard to have a lot of respect for either side in that debate, frankly.
When you say the gains are impressive, do you mean test scores?
Well, of course, we were trying to develop different kinds of things with the EcoLearn curriculum. Uh, we wanted students to gain in their knowledge of ecosystem science, and we used, standardized pre-post measures as a way of identifying what they had learned about ecosystem science from the various phases of these EcoLearn curricula. We wanted them to learn science inquiry, and there we were looking at their performance, not giving them a test about science inquiry, but, for example, putting them into a new ecosystem after they had completed dealing with the pond ecosystem and seeing in the forest ecosystem if they were able to hit the ground running faster because they had mastered some of the steps of inquiry in their initial work in the pond. We wanted them to care about the natural world more and the species that are in the natural world, to feel a sense of stewardship for the natural world. And that, was really more surveys and interviews to understand the kinds of changes in students' thoughts and feelings that might have taken place. So there were a lot of dimensions that we cared about, and we had the luxury over a 10-year period of finding ways to measure those and documenting where we succeeded and where we didn't make as much progress as we would have hoped. And I think that again is something that's often lacking from the criticisms of technology, is that the criticisms tend to be based on quantitative measures that typically are psychometric measures that aren't a good match for, did you learn inquiry, did you learn to care about the ecosystem, did your self-efficacy as a scientist go up, did you develop a growth mindset, and so on and so on.
Yeah, anyone who looks at your list of publications, and it's going to go back to the 1970s, and you're on the cutting edge of pretty much every educational technology. So you'll see on there online learning, you'll see uh, digital learning, and each one of those, I think I agree with you, they end up being a type of lecture based instruction or instructionism, which you were very critical of a few minutes ago, of the students being passive and memorizing information. And so, for example, online learning, where a teacher might record a lecture and then the student sits and watches, almost like watching a movie, right? And then taking a multiple choice test afterwards. And they never do this kind of active simulation. Uh, I think you implied that technology just always gets used that way. So what's going on? Why is it that, is there something about schools or the institution of schools that just, I don't know, pushes towards this, pushes away from a learning sciences based model? We need to get schools to use learning sciences research.
Well, it's ultimately, I think, that schools have become um, institutions that operate for their own sake. So what you learn in first grade is to help you learn to succeed in fourth grade, then seventh grade, then 10th grade, then getting into college, then maybe going into graduate school, or even all the way through a doctorate without ever having actually been out in the real world. It's preparation for further schooling is what the end goal ends up being. But the fact of the matter is, once you do graduate, at whatever level you graduate, you quickly find that nobody in the real world employs you to take tests. That's not a viable skill for making money and having a reasonable career. That you're employed, and this is particularly true now, in confronting things that no one in history has ever seen before. They're unprecedented. So there are no right answers. There are no models that experts have where they say, well, this is the right way to handle this and just go ahead and follow the steps. Instead, teams of people in the workplace are trying to figure out what on earth do I do given this unprecedented situation where we have to some extent, reinvent what we're doing, not once, but repeatedly. And when you work backwards to say, okay, if that's what people need from education, then what should education look like? Well, then it's a very different answer. People who say, well, it should look like lectures and tests, that answer has no validity at all. So the problem is, I think, that education, on the one hand, education says to parents and policymakers and businesses, we're preparing students for the world of work. But the fact of the matter is that they may be preparing students for the world of, arguably a century ago, but they're not preparing students for the world today. And that's really where this ends up, is that education isn't a good in and of itself. It's a service industry. And for education to ignore whether or not students are actually prepared for the workplace would be like medicine saying, well, we don't really keep track of how many people die, but we are interested in all these cool drugs and all these cool instruments that we're developing.
Right, right. Yeah, I call it creative knowledge. In this book up here, the creative classroom. And by creative knowledge, I mean the kind of knowledge that supports creative thinking and creative behavior. It's a deeper kind of knowledge that prepares you to go beyond what you're learning, which in instructionism is this kind of superficial memorization. But my impression, you mentioned inquiry as one of the outcomes of the project based learning that you advocate. And say a little bit more about that. But my impression is that when you learn in that way, that you actually do just as well on the standardized test and state standards, at least just as well. So you're not suffering by learning in a learning sciences manner. It doesn't make you do worse on the standardized test. So you're not really hurting the kids to teach them in a learning sciences way. Did I get that right?
Yeah, absolutely, Keith. And I think a couple decades ago, I was part of a national sciences, Academy of Sciences committee that published a book called Knowing What Students Know. It was a follow on to a very, very successful report called How People Learn that came out in 1999 and in an extended form in the year 2000. And we were the follow-on group to talk about assessment in 2003, knowing what students know. And we began the book in the preface with a little story about two students. And both students are asked on a test, when did Columbus discover America? And one student says 1492, and the other student says, I don't know. And okay, well, we got one student that got it right, and this other student, well, somehow schooling let them down. But then, if you ask them, why was it 1492 when Columbus discovered America? And the first student says, I don't know. 1492 is just one of, 500 dates I memorized to be able to answer questions like this. And the second student says, well, I don't know about the specific year, but it was around the end of this particular century because that's when navigation technology reached a certain point, and that's when the age of exploration was going on, and Europe was seeing opportunities for colonization, and that was when this was happening. That was when that was happening. Now, which student, you know, is prepared to do well in life and is the one that has benefited from education, and which student is ill prepared. And that was the whole theme, really, of that volume, which unfortunately, even though it was way ahead of its time, hasn't changed assessment any more than the work of the ed tech people who are learning scientists has changed the standard practices within education. But the 2003 book was all about what kind of education do people get where you can actually have people who can answer questions like that, and you can have tests that call on that kind of open-ended knowledge as opposed to saying, here's four distractors and a right answer.
All right, but let's talk about that some more because that's one of your many areas of expertise is assessment, and I think that's something our listeners might not realize that that's actually an area of research. You might average person might think, oh, with assessment, let's just count up how many facts people have memorized. So, say a little bit about that. How would you do research on assessment?
Well, I wrote a blog post during the pandemic that talked about measurement, and that this was an opportunity for us to move beyond just taking tests and to do richer things online that could lead to opportunities to measure things more deeply, because you can collect so much more information online about the process of learning than you can collect in a classroom setting. And then I used a medical example. I said, imagine that you're a doctor and you can't show up every day to look at what the patient is doing, or you can't measure every day what they have and haven't learned. But every couple weeks, you can order a single set of tests that provide a snapshot. And if the patient dies, then you basically can say, well, I didn't see it coming because I only had these every 2 week measures of what was going on. Now, no doctor would put up with that kind of situation, but that's exactly the situation the teachers are put in with the way that we measure student progress. And so, in the blog, I talked about the things that many sophisticated people in measurement and assessment, people with stronger backgrounds than mine, have been working on for a long time with great success. I think I think that the key is really to build it in from the very beginning. So we didn't, when we developed the eLearn curricula, we didn't just design these as learning experiences and motivational experiences. And then at the end, we say, oh, maybe we should measure whether we're succeeding or not. What can we do? Because that's where you end up with things like pre-post tests or, kind of Likert scale surveys. You begin at the beginning and you say, well, what would we like students to be able to perform at the end of this that they couldn't perform when they started? And then you design authentic assessments that really are rich process measures of the development of performances over time. And and that's possible because you thought about it from the beginning and you built it in. In other words, it's learning and assessment combined as opposed to learning followed by assessment, followed by learning, followed by assessment. And again, there's nothing new about this. Um, People in when I was a graduate student in the early 70s, people were writing about this. But again, we've stayed stuck with these kind of adequated and inadequate measures because education is all about preparing for further schooling and not so much about preparing for work and life.
I think that is a good time to ask you about your book. It's called, I think, the 60-year curriculum when you talk about future life. So, why is your book called the 60-year curriculum?
So in about 10 years ago, my colleague John Richards and I and others began working with Harvard's Department of Continuing Education, and it was kind of a challenging time for Harvard because the Department of Continuing Education was beginning to be the tail wagging the dog in terms of the number of people with Harvard degrees coming out of there versus the number coming out of the standard kind of Harvard experience. And yet, these people were coming out with very sophisticated knowledge and skills that paralleled what was happening in traditional face to face education. And what we were part of under the leadership of continuing education, both at Harvard but also across the country, was saying uh, lifelong learning should not be episodic. It shouldn't be that you learn, you get a degree, you don't learn anything for a while, then you have a promotion, so you have to learn something, or maybe you change careers, so you have to learn something, or maybe the nature of your work changes and you have to learn something just to keep your job. But it's episodic, and then you go back to not learning anything again until you have to. It should be continuous, and it should be progressive. And yeah, this is in part because the world is changing so rapidly, and people need to constantly be upgrading their knowledge and skills and dispositions and beliefs and self regulation in order to be able to cope with thriving on chaos. In the book, we talked about an analogous period from 1910 to 1960 with two world wars, a terrible pandemic after the First World War, the Great Depression, and then the start of the Cold War. And people have written books about the greatest generation that somehow faced all of this. Well, we said we're in the same place. This was in 2020. There's climate change. There's the failure to reach any of the 20 UN sustainability goals. There's advances in disruptive technologies like AI and biotech and nanotech and so on. And so we want to advocate for this 60-year curriculum, the concept being that if people are going to live to 90 and above, which is true even with the pandemic, you're going to outlive your money unless you work for about half a century. And it takes 10 years to get ready for having a series of careers over that half century, plus progressive continuous learning during that period. So it's really a 60-year curriculum, and who's going to do that? Well, um, not higher education as traditionally defined, but continuing education potentially as progressively defined. Ironically, um, our pessimistic forecast about what the world was going to be like was far too optimistic because after the book was written, we had the pandemic, we had the emergence of Gen AI, which has disrupted many things, and we've had the rise of authoritarianism across the world that has created a whole new set of issues and challenges. So, if anything, we were too optimistic about the need for this kind of continuous lifelong learning process.
Oh, I wanted to ask you also about generative AI because I know you've been writing about that recently as well. So, first of all, when we had internet search years ago, and the internet making the world's information available, if ever instructionism was a useless pedagogy, and the need for being able to think creatively was should have been the goal of education. That was true 30 and 40 years ago, but it certainly was true once you could search and find facts on the internet. And now it's even more true because you can search and find uh, more rich and sophisticated facts on the internet. So why lecture at people and have them memorize stuff? But is there anything new, fundamentally, qualitatively new about generative AI that changes the way we should be teaching and learning?
So first, my interactions with AI began over half a century ago when I was a graduate student in 1970, and I read the very first scholarly article about AI in education, in which the author confidently predicted that we wouldn't need teachers by the end of the 1970s. Well, that obviously wasn't a very good forecast. And in fact, I've lived through about 9 hype cycles for AI since then.
Yes.
About every 5 years, enough progress is made that the optimists declare that we have digital deities, and the pessimists declare that the Terminator is coming for us. And those extremes have been wrong for the last 9 hype cycles, and they're also wrong in this 10th hype cycle. But I will say that the leap within 5 years has been greater than the usual leap because Gen AI is, in fact, a different form of AI than what might be called knowledge based AI or classic AI or symbolic AI, and which is what I had been studying in the decades before that. And what Gen AI adds that is a significant advance is something that people in AI had been trying to do for 3/4 of a century, which is to interact with a machine using humans' natural language, as opposed to a machine's natural language, which is different kinds of programming code. And that has opened up a whole series of interesting things, but it's also opened up a big can of worms because um, people ascribe a kind of intelligence to Gen AI that it simply doesn't have. Um, Again, going back into the dim and distant past, in the 60s, there was a scholar at MIT who was a natural language expert and a AI computer scientist, Joseph Weizenbaum, and he developed a little program called ELIZA that mimicked a Rogerian therapist. And it wasn't really even AI, it was just a bag of tricks of different kinds, pattern recognition tricks. But people, to his horror, would spend hours and hours and hours talking to Eliza, thinking they were getting back therapeutic advice when it didn't understand a word that they said. And unfortunately, the same is true today with Gen AI. It isn't just a bag of tricks, it's based on digital neural nets and a training set. But at the end of the day, it doesn't understand a word that you're saying, and it may make a response that's appropriate uh, on a superficial level, but it's not a response that actually is useful therapy. And in fact, it often can be dangerous. So I think that um, what Gen AI has added is this dimension of natural language, and there are many ways in which it can be used positively. And I'm part of a National AI Institute that has built 7 tools that I think are major contributions. But for every way that it can be used positively, I see 10 ways in which it's being misused. And again, it's people using it to do better things better rather than to do better things. So faster ways of teaching by telling and learning by listening are what dominates Gen AI in education.
So, if you are a teacher and you're watching or listening to this episode, what would you tell that teacher? What's the most important advice you need to know?
Well, there's a very easy litmus test for understanding whether it's a good use of AI in learning or a bad use of AI in learning. And I'm saying this about learning specifically, as opposed to using AI at work for something that you fully understand. So, in learning, the destination is actually the journey. So, what we ask for in teaching is destinations that are proxies. Give me an essay that shows that you understand this particular complicated concept, or do a presentation, write a marketing plan, do a painting, etc. And we look at the proxy and we assume that the student took a journey that led them to be able to produce that proxy. So if it's an essay, what your goal is for the student to look inside of themselves for their own unique, creative, and original ideas based on their life, and then to learn how to organize those ideas and learn how to communicate them in a way that makes them compelling and interesting to others, and then produce an essay or a talk. But what happens if the students just do prompt engineering or vibe coding or whatever, and AI produces the essay is none of those things. It isn't their original ideas, it's AI's ideas. It isn't their organization, it's AI's organization. It isn't their ability to understand how to influence an audience, it's AI doing that. And so you end up with the student not having taken the journey and yet the teacher grading the destination. So that's the fundamental advice that I would have for teachers. Look at what the AI is doing. If the AI is empowering the student to take the journey, that's a good use of AI. If the AI is undercutting the student in taking the journey, that's a bad use of AI. It's not rocket science here to understand what's good and bad use of AI. And as an example of the institute that I'm part of, and what this might look like in specific terms, one of the things that my colleagues have developed is a tool called SMART. And SMART is designed to help students who are being used to explain something complicated at, as the end product of some kind of a learning experience. And it doesn't do the explanation for the student, but it does provide formative feedback. So you do a first draft and you feed it into SMART, and SMART says, well, there's 6 dimensions to this, and you've got 4 of them, but you're missing 2, and here's where you need to go look. And then you feed in the second draft, and SMART says, well, now you've got all 6, but 2 and 4 are interrelated, and you don't discuss that at all. And then at some point, SMART runs out of things to say because it's only an AI, and you turn it over to the human instructor, and the human instructor says, well, you've got all the dimensions, but this is dull as watching paint dry, and nobody's going to listen past the first 2 minutes. So you really need to find a way to liven this up, which AI is not capable of doing because AI doesn't understand what is capturing human attention or not capturing human attention. So that's an example of a tool that helps students on the journey, but it won't do the journey for them. And I think that's the kind of thing that the National AI Institutes in Education, of which there are 5, are working to develop. And those are good models for how people might think about, teachers might think about what they're consuming. And entrepreneurs and AI experts might think about what they're producing.
Well, that is great advice. And Chris, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.
Well, Keith, I appreciate the chance. One of the things that I did after only 53 years was to create a personal website. It's very easy to remember, chrisdede.com. And it is a big repository where under one tent I've put blogs and websites and curricula and scholarly articles and keynote speeches and all sorts of other things. And then I've tried to interweave them. So the advantage of there being all in one place is I can try to sort of cross reference and say, if this was interesting to you, take a look at that. And I hope people will just come and rummage around and find something that's of value to them. And I appreciate the chance to do an advert for that as part of participating in the wonderful blog series that you've got going.
Oh, absolutely. We'll put that website in the episode notes and the information about your book. And to the listeners, if you like this episode, please like and share the episode. And I hope you'll subscribe to the Science of Learning. Thank you for listening. Chris Dede is a legend in computers and learning. If you like the episode, I hope you'll like and share the episode and subscribe to The Science of Learning.